Tonight you will eat without thinking about it. You will open a fridge, or a cupboard, or an app, and food will simply appear. You will not wonder if there is enough. You will not wonder if it will still be there tomorrow. For almost the entire history of your species, that certainty did not exist. So what did a single day of eating actually look like for the people who came before the fridge, before the supermarket, before the guarantee? The answer is stranger than you think. It is also more exhausting, more communal, and in some ways healthier than your own. Start before sunrise. A medieval peasant does not wake up hungry in the way you do. There is no breakfast waiting. In most of medieval Europe, the first meal of the day barely exists as a formal event. The historian Christopher Dyer, who spent decades reconstructing the diets of ordinary English villagers from manorial records, found that many laborers simply grabbed bread and weak ale before heading into the fields. Not a meal, a fueling, something eaten standing up, walking, already late for work that never technically starts on time because the sun decides when it starts. That ale matters more than it sounds like it should. Water in a medieval village is not something you trust. Wells sit close to livestock. Rivers carry waste from upstream. So people drink ale, weak, low alcohol, brewed daily, sometimes by the same household that eats the bread beside it. Adults drink it. Children drink it. It is less a vice than a filtration system, and it quietly kept entire villages alive by accident. Isn't it strange that getting a little bit drunk every single day from childhood onward may have been one of the most effective public health measures of the medieval world? By mid-morning, the real eating begins, and it centers on one object: bread. Not the soft, pale loaf on your counter. Dense, dark, coarse bread, often made from a mix of grains, rye and barley, and whatever the harvest allowed, sometimes stretched with peas or beans in a lean year. The historian C.M. Woolgar, who studied diet and status across medieval English households, found that bread could make up more than half of a peasant's daily calories. Half. Imagine building your entire day around a single food, the way you build your day around your phone. That is what bread was. It was the fridge, the pantry, and the plate. But bread alone will not carry a body through 12 hours of field work. So beside it sits pottage. If you have never heard the word, picture a thick vegetable stew, simmering in a single pot over a low fire for days, sometimes weeks, with new ingredients added as they arrive, and old ones long since dissolved into the broth. Cabbage, onions, leeks, whatever beans the household had stored. Meat, when there was meat, cut so small it barely counted as an ingredient and more as a rumor of flavor. The pot never fully empties. It never gets a real clean start. It just keeps going, day after day. A slow-motion meal that never technically ends. Here is where your assumptions probably break. You picture medieval food as meat, roasted boar, turkey legs the size of your forearm. That image comes almost entirely from feasts thrown by nobles, and nobles were a tiny fraction of the population. For the overwhelming majority of people, meat was rare, expensive, reserved for feast days, for Christmas, for the handful of saints' days scattered through the calendar like small permitted holidays. On an ordinary Tuesday in March, there was no meat. There was bread, there was pottage, there was ale, and there was, always, the question underneath it all: would there be enough of even that? The calendar itself pressed down on every meal, and not just the harvest calendar. The medieval church demanded fasting roughly a third of the year. No meat on Fridays, no meat through all of Lent, no eggs, sometimes no dairy, depending on how strictly a household followed the rules. So even the small amount of animal protein a family might have counted on could vanish for weeks at a stretch, replaced by fish if you lived near water, or by nothing at all if you didn't. Did you know that for a peasant hundreds of miles from the coast, a landlocked fasting season could mean living on bread, pottage, and little else for over a month, simply because the calendar said so? Because here's the twist that changes everything. A bad harvest did not mean a bad month. It meant a bad year, sometimes several. Bruce Campbell, an economic historian who reconstructed medieval English harvest yields from tax and manorial data, documented cycles where a single poor summer could cut a family's food supply by a third or more, with no way to buy their way out of it, because there was often simply nothing to buy. When you skip a meal today, you order something else. When a medieval village lost its harvest, the entire community shrank its meals for a year, together, and hoped the next planting went better. Hunger was not a personal failure, it was weather. So people ate to survive the gaps, not just the day. Pottage stretched thin in bad years, thickened in good ones. Bread got coarser when grain ran short, bulked out with acorns or dried peas that a modern nutritionist might raise an eyebrow at, but that kept a family standing through February. And February, not summer, was the hardest month of all, because the harvest was months away and the stores from autumn were running out. Isn't it strange that your ancestors could tell you exactly how afraid to be just by looking at how much grain was left in the barn? Preserving that autumn harvest was its own daily labor, invisible now but constant then. Salting meat and fish so heavily that some historians believe medieval palates simply adjusted to a level of saltiness a modern tongue would reject outright. Smoking what could be smoked, drying peas, beans, and apples until they turned hard and dull, then soaking them back to life months later in the same pottage pot. Root vegetables buried in sand or straw to keep the frost out. None of this was a hobby. It was the only insurance policy a household had, and it had to be rebuilt from nothing every single autumn, with no guarantee the next harvest would be kind enough to let you do it again. Midday brought the largest meal, eaten together, often in the field itself if the work demanded it. This is not a small detail. Eating happened in groups almost by default, not by choice, because cooking took hours and fuel was scarce, and it made no sense for every household to run its own fire when one shared pot could feed several families. Meals were loud, communal. Nobody ate alone by accident the way you might tonight, scrolling through a screen with a bowl balanced on your knee. Food was one of the only times an exhausted, overworked population sat still, together, and simply existed in the same space. Children ate differently, but not the way you might expect. There was no separate children's menu, no smaller, gentler version of the meal. A child old enough to chew ate what the household ate, bread softened in ale or broth if their teeth weren't ready for the crust. Infants were breastfed for years by modern standards, often 2 or 3, partly from necessity, because there was no reliable substitute, and partly because it quietly spaced out births in households that could not have afforded more mouths arriving too close together. Even nursing, in other words, was food security, working quietly in the background of a decision nobody framed that way at the time. And if you had been born into a monastery instead of a village, your entire relationship with food would flip. Monastic account rolls, the kind Christopher Dyer and other historians have combed through in painstaking detail, show that monks and nuns often ate considerably better than the peasants working the land around them, with more fish, more eggs, more wheat bread instead of the coarser village loaf, and far more consistency from one season to the next. The monastery had storage, organization, and land. It managed with an efficiency most individual households could never match. Isn't it strange that some of the best-fed people in medieval Europe were the ones who had formerly renounced worldly pleasure? By evening, the meal shrank again, echoing the morning. More bread. Whatever remained of the pottage. Maybe cheese, if the household kept a goat or a cow, which many did, because dairy was one of the few reliable proteins that did not require killing an animal you depended on for milk and labor. Eggs, if the chickens were laying. And then, as the light failed and candles were expensive and firewood was not infinite, the day simply ended. There was no late-night snack. There was no second dinner. There was sleep, and then there was the next round of bread and ale, and the cycle continued, largely unchanged, for centuries. Here is the part that should genuinely surprise you. Bioarchaeologists studying medieval skeletons, examining the isotopes locked into centuries-old bone and teeth, have found something your instincts probably resist. Many ordinary medieval people, in years without famine, ate a diet that modern nutritionists would recognize as remarkably balanced. High in fiber from all that coarse grain, rich in vegetables from a pottage pot that never stopped simmering, low in sugar because sugar barely existed outside noble households, low in processed fat because nothing was processed at all. The isotope evidence doesn't lie about status either. It shows the gap in diet between a peasant and a lord as clearly as a modern blood test shows income, written straight into the bone. None of this means medieval eating was good. It means it was honest in a way yours rarely has to be. Every mouthful was tied, directly and visibly, to weather, to labor, to luck, to the church calendar hanging over the whole year. You eat disconnected from all of it. Your bread does not know if the rain came late this year. Your dinner has never once depended on whether you personally survived a long enough winter to plant again in spring. So tonight, when you open that fridge without a second thought, without calculating the harvest, without wondering if February will run short, Remember what that certainty actually cost centuries to build. Medieval people did not eat less because they wanted less. They ate what the sky allowed. They ate together because the fire demanded it. And they built an entire rhythm of life, of bread and pottage and shared meals, around a question you will never have to ask out loud. Will there be enough? Tonight you will eat without thinking about it, and that, more than anything, is the real miracle.